There. Now, Allie Renison is a former UK Trade Department official. She's now at consultancy SEC Newgate. Allie, thanks so much for joining us. Before we go into the China-Africa deal, I have to ask you about the breaking news around Donald Trump. We are just hearing in the last half an hour that he's decided to slap 25% on EU vehicles. What does this mean, and what do you think's going on here?
Well, I think, as with many of President Trump's social media posts, we have to wait to see what is actually followed up with in terms of proposals coming from the U.S. government, from the U.S. Trade Representative's office about exactly what that means. Now, I think there's a couple of different things going on here. Trump does have a long-standing gripe about the trade imbalance, particularly in cars. Previously, the EU's average tariff for cars and auto vehicles going into the European market is about 10%. The U.S.'s was about 2%. And I think President Trump has talked about the fact that he'd like to see more brand name American trucks being driven on German streets, in addition to the luxury vehicles from Germany that get driven on American highways. So there is a long-standing gripe, but I think that, as was alluded to before, there's also some frustration on a twofold front from the Trump administration with the EU. One is obviously that in terms of the conflation with foreign policy, they're being quite slow to support his offensive strikes, particularly countries like Spain, taking a very hard line. But I think also that there have been some question marks about what the U.S. and the EU agreed to as a provisional trade outline framework a couple of months ago. It's been very slow getting through the EU channel. So I think that this is meant to put pressure on a few different fronts.
Yeah, and as you say, while we've seen the Euro car stocks already reacting, dropping quite sharply, we've got to see how this actually pans out. Allie, let's talk more about the zero tariff deal for all bar one African country from China. How much is going to really benefit? Which countries, which products do you see real benefit for?
I think, it depends on what the tariff treatment of some of these products was to begin with, because obviously those that were facing steep tariffs already, if you see them looking at for example, tea coming from South Africa, fresh produce, fruits and vegetables coming from other parts of the continent going into China, those had fairly high agricultural tariffs, and particularly the ones that weren't included in what we call provisions around least developed countries that already have fairly generous provisions unilaterally from China, and also those countries who were already part of the China-Africa agreement. It was about 20 of them. They're not going to see a huge change, but those that weren't party to those liberalized tariff provisions definitely will see some change in the processed and raw agricultural commodities market. I think it's a bigger question about outside of that, what are the huge changes? I think we're looking at critical minerals is an interesting area that China is definitely interested in increasing the flow, the two-way flow on critical minerals and making sure that it has access to Africa's market. So it's a real statement of intent in a few areas, and it contrasts sharply, obviously, with the direction of travel from the U.S.
And of course, it's not just tea and apples. As Michael's piece explained, also, South Africa, for example, produces a lot of cars for export. Do you see this as an opportunity to attract investors and actually get real growth going, not just the export of raw materials and commodities?
Exactly, and I think that that's what some of these trade provisions, and keep in mind it is predominantly a unilateral measure that China has extended to African countries. But I think what we're waiting to see is the opportunity around, does this really help consolidate trade and investment ties more widely? For example, bringing in perhaps some of the know-how to help build with some of the infrastructure and industries of the future in Africa, including in, for example, in the automotive market. I think that what both sides are hoping to see is this consolidation of ties that gives it investors more confidence to say that this is a relationship that is only growing from strength to strength.
All right, thank you so much. That's Allie Renison, former UK Trade Department official, now a consultant at SEC Newgate.